Great. Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome along, and thank you for joining us to this session, which is reading and writing, reciprocity in teaching and practice, in celebration of the summer issue of our newsletter, which came out a couple of weeks ago. Just a quick introduction. I'm Becky. I'm the Chief Exec of the English Association, and I'm really pleased to see you this afternoon. And about the English Association, we are a learned society and subject association which was founded in 1906 to support, promote, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education, from primary and early years through to secondary and further education, to higher education and beyond. And we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you so much to our panelists who have joined us this afternoon. Our members also make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. So if you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please do consider joining us. From now until December, our memberships are discounted pro rata, so it will cost you just £28 today to join us for the rest of the year and to support our events and campaigning work. And you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals, and of course the newsletter is one of those. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of tonight's conversation, Professor Robert Fraser. Robert is Emeritus Professor in the Open University's Department for English and Creative Writing and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, the English Association and the Royal Asiatic Society. His 28 published books include biography, criticism, international book history, poetry, fiction and memoir, and his latest book, Tartini's Rest, Tales Two Brothers Told, is published this August. I'll hand over to you, Robert. Thank you.
My first pleasant task is to thank all of our panelists for their splendid contribution to the newsletter, which came out about a month ago. Just to remind everybody, the theme of the issue is the relationship between reading and writing, and also the relationship between creativity and the critical intelligence. Now, these should all be sister pursuits, complementary pursuits. But sometimes there seems to be a problem in that reading and writing seem somehow to lose sight of one another, and creativity and criticism tend to lose touch with one another at various points in the educational system. All of our contributors have got experience of wrestling with these problems, of somehow trying to reconcile creativity and criticism and marrying the two. Can I start with you, Barbara?
Fine, yes. I was told I should kind of briefly introduce myself, so that's what I'll do. I was an English teacher for many years and a head of English. I then went to work at the English and Media Centre, where creative criticality, the relationship between reading and writing, has always been a kind of, really, really important thing for me. I'm also a fiction writer and most recently a children's poetry writer. So I bring together those sort of elements into my work as well. So I was asked to talk about the question of whether reading is sometimes regarded as a passive activity and writing as an active pursuit, and is that distinction valid, and what might one do with students to show them that this kind of separation is not a valid one. And it seems to me that we're always writing, in a way, the text we read, not on paper maybe, but in our heads. We're filling in gaps. We're playing a really active role in making the text mean something to us. Interpretation isn't something that we do after reading. It's happening from the very first words we read. So if I read a text with you which starts, "Once upon a time, 100 years ago, there was a dark and stormy girl," which is the opening of a novel. From the very first words you're listening to, you're writing that story for yourself. You're telling yourself what genre it's in. You're questioning why it seems to swerve violently away from your expectations, perhaps. And you're probably asking yourself a whole heap of questions about where the story is going, who it's for, what will come next. You probably want me to answer those questions. You're a reader, but you're also, in a way, the writer. Your interpretation will be different from any other. And Louise Rosenblatt, the queen of reader response theory, puts this beautifully when she says, text is just ink on a page until a reader comes along and gives it life. The reader brings to the work personality traits, memories of past events, present needs and preoccupations, a particular mood of the moment, and a particular physical condition. These and many other elements in a never to be duplicated combination determine his response to the text. And the writer, Francine Prose, says of the reverse process, being a writer rather than a reader, if we want to write, it makes sense to read, and to read like a writer. If we wanted to grow roses, we would want to visit rose gardens and try to see them the way that a rose gardener would. So I think students need to be encouraged to read like writers and write like readers. They will benefit from this. And over the course of many years, EMC, where I work in our CPD and resources, have always been committed to this idea and have offered multiple and varied activities and approaches that range from tiny little experiments to full-scale adaptations and writing inspired by texts. Just one small example. In Literary Shorts, one of our publications, collection of short stories, I wrote a story called Doing That, and it was published there. And over lockdown, we ran a competition for students to adapt the story or be inspired by it in any way they liked. The winning piece turned the story into a screenplay, and I thought it was an absolutely brilliant adaptation. It was not just cleverly done and a new creative text of great merit in its own right. It also demonstrated deep understanding of my story and what was at stake in it. It was both an excellent creative and critical act. So how do we persuade students of the benefits? That's another of the questions that Robert asked us. Well, I think getting them to do little experiments in writing as they read is a very, very good way. Tiny little things along the way. What if experiments are great? What if you changed the voice or the tense? What if you left out that line or added another? And then the what ifs can get bigger. What if you wrote it in the voice of someone who's on the margins or silenced in the text? What difference would it make to change the genre and so on? Writing around texts is illuminating of texts, and reading and thinking about what authors have chosen to do will open up a world of possibilities for students' own creative writing. What else persuades students of the benefits of doing it? Well, it's deeply pleasurable and it's very illuminating. Very recently, in fact, last weekend, I did a creative critical task with a group of teachers, a couple of whom are here. And there was a lot of laughter, a lot of pleasure, and I hope a great deal of interest. I did the same sort of thing with some 40 secondary English teachers this week in CPD, and the feedback had very similar words repeated. It was inspiring, it was fun. Even my lower attaining students could do this, and so on. So doing a bit of it in a low stakes way and a relaxed way seems to me a gateway drug to wanting to do a lot more.
Thank you very much indeed, Barbara. I think you say in your piece that on the pattern of fairy story, some of your students start writing something beginning once upon a time. And lo and behold, Freddie begins his piece in the newsletter. Once upon a time, this happy couple lived a merry married life together, reading and writing poetry, putting on plays, and reveling in make-believe. But with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, the British Empire, and the social sciences, their love cooled. English was wooed with promises of professionalism, national significance, and measurable progress, and packed its bags for the academy, leaving its estranged partner to wander the enchanted forests and hedgerows all alone. So, Freddie, from your extensive experience of sixth form teaching, what on earth has gone wrong?
What has gone wrong? Oh, there's a question. Um, if only we had more time. I mean, part of what has gone wrong is what happens prior to A level within the GCSE, where students are kind of drilled in kind of powerful writing, and the importance of reading Dickens as a sort of textbook of Victorian London, and reading Shakespeare as a handbook to Elizabethan patriarchy. I could go on. I mean, GCSE is a profoundly uncreative study of literature. And so when they come to study at A level, part of our job is to try and unpick that, and it can be too late.
Yeah. So what do you do about it?
What do we do about it? Well, gosh, well, I suppose, try and put in place a little bit kind of stuff that Barbara's talking about. Um, I mean, certainly, I think it's really important to sort of set the tone at the outset of A-level teaching to sort of clear up any of those misperceptions. Because if you do read if you're the kind of student who, and we do have many of them, who kind of look diligently at the exam board sort of assessment objectives, they may pick up the wrong cues, because those assessment objectives very, very rarely appear to reward kind of what we're talking about here, which is sort of spirited, original, kind of creative responses. Their language tends to be very much kind of the professional study, analytical, evaluative, sustained textual examples, correct terminology, all those cues. So I find it very important to kind of do a lot of very direct messaging, which is around the fact that, what we're engaged in is a process of collective meaning making. A lot of what I teach in the first term is poetry, which I find useful because what I can do is immediately get them to think about poetry as something which is not purely read, but something which is heard, something which is felt, something which requires imaginative responses. So you can kind of reframe the process of reading as being something other than a purely rational exercise.
That's a perfect bridge to you, Tim, because you've attempted to cross this divide by getting students to learn poetry by heart and recite it in public. And as they're doing that, surely they're both readers and writers. They're both critics and creators. Can you talk us through your project a bit, Tim? Tim? Tim, can you unmute yourself?
Am I unmuted? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
I'll prefix the statement just by saying that I find it bizarre the way that reading and writing have themselves been sort of put in different pools. I mean, we've got the writing framework has come out today from the DFE. We had a reading framework last year. I find it odd that insights from the Bullock report about reading and writing being bound up with speaking and listening. Main contribution to Bullock to the teaching of English, and this is 50 years ago, was that it's much more realistic and productive to think about reading and writing as being bound up with speaking and listening. So what I'd say about poetry, first thing, we had no idea that poetry by heart would work. Neither Julie nor I ever particularly memorized poems when we were teaching in state schools. What seems to happen is if you listen to poets and what they say about poetry, they often talk as if it has an imaginary of being shared aloud in performance, or sometimes perhaps by being signed. So although poetry is thought of as being inscribed in writing, its longer history is within a tradition of orality and oracy, and of the memorability of poetry. I think if you look at some of the poems on our website and Poetry by Heart, particularly where we've got lots of examples, you can see that it really does seem to be the case that although poetry is inscribed in writing, it is imagined, it is conceptually spoken, and it's not possible to speak a poem, certainly if you've learned it by heart and you're in the flow of that poem. It's not possible to speak a poem without conveying an interpretation. So if you watch, 3 or 4 examples of Ozymandias, you'll see that, lots of examples on the website. So reading and writing, I suppose recitation, which is a fairly ancient practice around text, one that dates back to before inscribed written records and certainly before print. If you go back, then it shows that reading, in other words, taking in, reading in the sense of taking in a text and then sharing it out loud, it's a social process. And it's also an interpretive process, inevitably an interpretive process. It's a cross-mode process by which the written becomes spoken, or the memorized becomes spoken. And then there is this other final point I'll make about poetry, which I always found quite funny, given my thesis was supervised by Gunter Kress, who always brought attention to the materiality of text. But actually, when a poem is taken in and learnt by heart, it's not clear where it exists, except in the molecules.
Thank you very much indeed. We're all very grateful for you for setting up this project, which is obviously very, very flourishing indeed. That's one organizational way of somehow bridging the gap between reading, writing, criticism, and creativity. Another organizational project which has taken this on board is Thomas Carsham's project on his creative critical project at the University of East Anglia. I don't think Thomas is here, is he?
Oh, I am.
Oh, you are? Well, okay.
I am.
Can you talk us through your project and what it hopes to achieve?
Yeah, and I'll try to do so, and I'll try to pick up on what others have said as well in doing so. If the question is how we remedy these problems at school and university level, I would say 2 things. I would say, firstly, that there have always been complaints about the stultifying nature of school teaching, no matter how noble and well considered the pedagogical ambitions are. However, I must say I teach at an institution where I think a lot of the teaching is a model, University of East Anglia, of creative critical practice, where there's a great deal of joy, a great deal of flair, and a great deal of originality. Now, of course, we have more latitude at university level, but I think it's partly that our assessment criteria specify those qualities for the higher grades. So we know that the assessment tail wags every dog at all levels. Barbara and I were just at English Shared Futures conference last week, and although the exam boards talk a good game about wanting to encourage and reward thoughtfulness and creativity and flair at GCSE and A level, as Freddie comments in his piece, if you actually look at their marking specifications, those words do not come up in their criteria for the higher grades. So that would be a simple and extremely powerful fix, number one. Number two, it does strike me as a culture, we're quite vague on what we want from English education these days. Leavers, for all his faults, knew exactly what he wanted English to do. That was the last time there was a completely coherent pedagogical program. And you can say the same of Erasmus. So I think we need to think through our total purposes in English, and not just for what it will do for literature, but what it will do for culture and the human being. And certainly where I teach, when Bradbury set up English at UEA, he said his aim was to rebuild bridges between the creative and the critical. And he didn't just mean as branches of literature, but as branches of the spirit. So without a complete cultural vision, I don't think that you can have a really coherent view of what you're trying to achieve in pedagogy. My project is attempting to put the essay alongside a very wide range of other forms of student writing and speaking that once flourished in European and American classrooms until the 19th century, when the essay, like a meteor, extinguished that vast zoo of pedagogical forms. So My own view, and I have the honor of working closely with Barbara and Andrew at the English and Media Centre, is that we can and should encourage the development at schools of what is already happening in university English departments around the world, of a very wide range of kinds of student writing, not excluding the academic essay, and encouraging students to try their hand at all of those. And we should put those in the context of a body of thinking which recognizes that even essay writing is creative rewriting and textual transformation, and is therefore a creative act, um, and um, and that turning a poem into a short story, or turning a piece of Kafka into a film script, is also already a critical act. The final question we were given: how can we promote authentic originality? I would say it's by encouraging all writers, all student writers, to reflect on their own writing as critics and to begin to recognize all the cliches that we start from. So good, real originality begins from a recognition of the cliches we all live in, would be my answer. It doesn't begin by trying to be original. So criticism is always essential to creativity in that sense.
Thank you, Thomas. JC, does Thomas's experience at UEA correspond to yours in York?
Yeah, thank you. These are all interesting questions, and I think you're right that different places, different institutions, different levels of teaching do approach these things in quite different ways. York creative writing is newer as a kind of formalized discipline here than it is someplace like UEA, and so we're learning from those different models. And it does mean we have the advantage of seeing all these different other exciting models that other people have used. I do see some of the same kind of binaries that people are talking about, and some of that is kind of this sense of, what happens when students reach us. What have they gone through in school? What are the different kinds of expectations and the assessments that they've gone through that have made them think, in variously entrenched ways about critical and creative practices. I guess one of the ways I was really interested in, the kind of one of the provocations that we had talked about before this conversation, was whether a binary between knowledge and skills is applicable to creativity and criticality, or reading and writing. And I think that is quite a useful way of kind of thinking about the practical kind of problems of how we teach this. I was also interested to read I was reading the writing framework from the government first thing this morning, and I was very interested to hear what those with more experience in schools thought of it. But one thing I did notice is there's, at those levels they're talking about, from reception, in those early years, there is quite a close kind of relationship between skills and knowledge, and a real emphasis on the kinds of knowledge that's needed in order to write well, and that the two things. So the question for me becomes, what happens to separate these things by the time they reach university? And I do think within universities and higher education, I think there are different kind of forces trying to separate those things, and some of those come from outside the discipline. I think the instrumentalizing of the discipline, the emphasis on employability and outcomes for students, it seems to put a natural emphasis on skills. And we talk a lot about transferable skills, where we don't talk about transferable knowledge in the same way, in the humanities at least. And I think that, is an interesting kind of problem in a tension there. But it's also something I guess I see in the way that we talk about creativity, I think, ourselves as something that's sort of opposed to knowledge, or in some cases, you find a lot of writers talking about creativity and creative writing as an unknowing or a not knowing. And there are different, there's a history of this kind of, almost a kind of, a valorization of kind of not knowing what we're doing, and that it's a kind of, whether it's an intuitive practice or it's something that goes against. And I think, on some levels, I agree with that, and I can see absolutely what this idea of creativity as something that it isn't just a matter of dates and figures that we can just confer, and then they can take that and produce poetry or fiction, or whatever it might be. But I do think there is knowledge, and the kind of knowledge they're talking about in the writing framework, not just spelling and grammar, but like knowledge of genre, and knowledge of form, and knowledge of literary history. I think we undervalue that in some ways. And I think it's sort of, looking at that timeline from when they first enter school to imagining, an ideal, setup when we think about the kind of writing we want to read, and we think, oh, creative critical writing that crosses these boundaries, that, is about unknowing, and it's about making us ask questions and challenge everything we want in the world. If university sits somewhere in the middle of that timeline, thinking about, where we put that emphasis on real knowledge, because that's something I have noticed at York and other places and with colleagues, is, increasingly creative writing students not reading, saying, well, I want to write, and kind of, and thinking of that as a kind of process that is mystified in a particular way. And then writers saying, yes, my process, I can't hardly talk about it, is kind of has this sort of intuitive side. And conversely, then critical literature students, where they're just, a lot of their essays kind of just being knowledge dumps, and they kind of they don't have the skills to process all the quotations and all the jargon that they're using. And somehow I think connecting knowledge and skills back together seems important for thinking about these questions.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think we all have these commendable ideas, and we all want to re-celebrate the marriage between creativity and criticism. But we also seem to agree that at certain points in the system, in the profession, there are areas of resistance, people who don't want this to happen. So Megan, you've chosen to address the last question, which I suppose is the most provocative one. Do you actually think that somewhere in the system, bureaucratic, educational, or whatever, there are pockets of resistance to creativity?
I think I'm going to start off by responding to your provocation, Robert, by explaining that I'm sitting in a kind of perhaps a different sphere of education from everybody else on the panel. So my area of particular interest is the acquisition of literacy for children in the early years and all the way through primary school. So I'm looking at that through the lens of perhaps the newly published writing framework, the reading framework, and from those other perspectives. I'm also not looking at this through the lens of perhaps an English, what we might call an English perspective, but very much more through the lens of literacy. So the acquisition of reading and writing skills, and that's where my area of particular interest and kind of knowledge base sort of lies, really. And so when we look at that idea around assessment and whether I feel that there is a sense within the collective community in primary and early year settings whether assessment affects children's abilities to become and respond and use reading and writing processes creatively, I think I have to kind of suggest very tentatively, but I think that there is an assumption that that's what happens within the primary school and early years sector. Children jump through quite a considerable number of phases and stages which check and measure their literacy acquisition in lots of different ways, and often creative responses to reading and writing our creative acts within reading and writing acquisition are less valued. And I think you can see that hugely coming through, especially in the newly publicised writing framework, the newly published writing framework, where there is much less of a focus on perhaps writing for communicative purposes, to express your wants, needs, wishes, thoughts, ideas and reflections, and very much more of an emphasis on what JT might emphasise as the knowledge base behind it. So letters, words, sentences, mainly sentences, a lot of sentences that come through. And I think what we have, having just listened to a really fascinating presentation by Christina Clark from the National Literacy Trust on their research around whether young people write for pleasure and engage in literary acts because they want to volitionally, and the upshot of that is they don't, then we do have a bit of a challenge here. We have a bit of an issue, and that's where things like Poetry for All and the stuff that Tim does is just so amazing, because it really does provide an opportunity and gives agency to teachers, and almost in a way allows them to step outside the restrictions of the curriculum, the frameworks, the assessments that they have, and really engage in that kind of critical
pleasurable, enjoyable, creative act that comes with, having some facility around reading and writing. I mean, my final thought on this is that there is coming through, particularly from early years and within the primary sector at the moment, this conceptualization that you can't be creative unless you know lots of stuff. That unless you know every letter of the alphabet, you can't write, you can't spell, and I just don't think that's right. The research literature that I'm very familiar with also suggests that that's not an appropriate way of motivating and driving our children forward to be able to engage with these things. We need to allow them to celebrate and engage and become excited about the prospect of being able to share their wants, needs, wishes, thoughts, ideas, reflections with the world through this kind of wonderful medium that we have, and to understand the sort of subtleties that others have put into their own writing processes when they go. Thank you, Tim. I like your thumbs up. That was great.
Well, thank you very much. It seems to me that at the beginning of the educational process at primary school, elementary school, the twin arts of reading and writing have got an obvious relationship, and they're both taught together. Also, if you go to the other end of the educational system at university, by and large, university lecturers create their own syllabi and they set their own exams. The problem seems to me to set in the last few years of secondary school, where assessment takes over, and assessment is in the hands of exam boards who often aren't interested in listening to the concerns of teachers. Is this a fair observation?
No, I think that applies all the way through education, the system. Although in primary and early years we don't have exam boards as such, but we do have statutory assessments that are very tightly controlled.
Tim?
I think there's a strange thing that goes on with exam boards. The discourse of English teachers around exam boards can be unfortunate. I remember Sue Dimmock once talking about the effect of the dead hand of the anthology on poetry teaching, not knowing that actually the point of giving out the anthology by AQA in the 1990s was so every child did have a collection of poetry. So I think sometimes exam boards are othered and they're forgotten that they're actually teachers. And my experience is that they do listen. I think something fairly monstrous is going on. Maybe monstrous is too extreme. There's something fundamentally problematic going on in early years. I agree with everything Megan's saying. It doesn't have to be like that. If you read Gunter Kress's books on spelling, on an early literacy that were written about 15 years ago, you might well question Thomas Carsham's sort of idea that there wasn't actually anything much after Leavis. There was actually a consensus. It was around Brian Street and his ideas of literacy as a social practice. And his comment that skills whenever you hear the word skills, think about social practices instead. It was Gunter Kress and his awareness that text was always materially enacted and in speech and writing or digital entry. You had ethnographic observation. I've just written about this in an essay that I feel a bit odd to have had to write about, and I'll send it to you, Megan. I've written a critique of literacy policy over the last 3 or 4 decades, and particularly the unscientific beliefs around phonics. And I think it's really unfortunate, actually, that the Academy hasn't spent quite a lot of time thinking about what's going on in GCSE and not nearly enough critiquing what's going on in things like the writing framework and in the reading framework. And we've actually let a quite problematic regulative discourse around knowledge crassly defined. For example, the stuff on spelling is not the stuff that you'll read in Mark Seba when he talks about spelling as a social and political act and his attention to non-standard spelling or variational spelling. The Academy has ignored what's going on in the early years and left it to the phonics experts who are having an undue influence in certain quarters. And I think this could have repercussions for creativity later on. I'm one of the people who actually introduced modules in things like in transforming text and so on in AQA in the years coming out the millennium. That was possible because of the teaching that had been going on that led into it, including the contribution of the English and Media Centre. So my challenge is to the Academy to start looking at, reading and critiquing the regulative discourse that's coming into early years and that Megan's having to work with.
Megan, any response to that?
It sounds great. I'd love to read your critique and the article that you read. Please do send it along. I think there's a lot of conversation that needs to happen around these sort of areas where we're helping young children develop reading and writing skills. But more than anything, I think what I would really like to see is a kind of a sector-led understanding of what it means to be a reader and what it means to be a writer, and also what it means to be articulate and being in control of your ability to express yourself orally. Because I think somewhere along the line that's got lost. So I think perhaps from my perspective, we don't really necessarily always have a vision of what we want children to be able to do by the time they get to year five and year six. It's more about whether they've gone past the exams or not. And just to kind of conclude on that, I've just done a piece of research with some colleagues where we asked primary practitioners and colleagues across the entire sector, so stakeholders from publishers, charities, all sorts of things, what their professional definition of reading was. And from 105 responses, over 90% of them defined reading as word recognition and language comprehension. And I'll just leave you with that.
Thank you very much. Becky, have we got any questions from the audience?
We don't have any questions from the audience yet, but Tommy's had his hand up, so maybe Tommy, if you want to come in.
Can I come back to you?
I actually want to pick up on what Megan said and approach it from two different angles, or rather, I want to introduce an angle from the opposite end. In other words, what's happening at the level of academic research and PhD and how this is feeding down, but also maybe to try to link it to early years. So I think when you ask what are the obstacles in our discipline to that fusion of creativity and criticism we want, I think you've got to realize that academics are supposed to be knowledge producers. That's how the funding bodies define us. Increasingly over the last 20 years, work in English is called research, and we're understood as producing knowledge. All of this is extraordinarily dangerous and diminishes what we do. And it has, because those are the institutional frameworks, you have to be a very brave academic to want to write about the aesthetic properties of literature or to do anything other than pile up knowledge. So that is a massive pressure at the top of the system, at the kind of prestiged granting bit of the system. And I remember in 1999, when I was a young graduate student, a teacher telling me they just introduced a lot of historicist elements into A-level English, and my heart sank. So I don't know the details of what's happened since then, but I suspect that was a really disastrous moment when the popular new historicism of that period diminished a great deal of the skills-based work. And the way I would just link this, surprisingly perhaps back to Megan, is that what I so admire about Renaissance education is that there was really the same thing being done with 7-year-olds and with university students. It was all the art of language. Whether you were a young child first learning to play with rhyme or a university student writing odes, you cannot be a good poet or a novelist, nor a good critic, without fundamentally being interested in the raw matter of composition. And that is a skill. I have no sympathy at all for the attempt to turn English into a discipline of knowledge. It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever.
Well, thank you, Thomas, and thank you for introducing us to your project, which seems absolutely essential in this regard. How are you hoping to reach out and involve teachers at different levels in your project to make sure that it's not simply a project which involves people at the tertiary level, but involves people right across the spectrum?
Thank you very much for the invitation, Robert. I'll be as brief as possible because I'd like Barbara to be able to speak. But I'm working with a co-investigator at the Institute of Education. We have partner PGC leads across the country, and there will be a postdoctoral research associate who will be making school visits to schools all across the country over 2 years, and we have travel money built into the bid to bring teachers from across the country to our events, and the EMC will be running a whole series of CPD courses for teachers across the UK.
And I noticed
And I would love to hear from anyone listening to this.
Indeed. I noticed you're already working with Barbara. So we began with you, Barbara. Can we end with you?
I just wanted to say a little bit about the whole knowledge and skills thing, which I think is so interesting and important. And you know, picking up on what Freddie said about knowledge dumping by students, and what Tommy has said also about the kind of privileging of knowledge and so forth. And I kind of hate the way that knowledge and skills have become dichotomized, if there is such a word, you know, sort of regarded as being binary and different. Because actually, I can't think of anything that we do when we do English. That's Bob Eagleston's term, doing English. What do we do? It's a kind of act. It's an active thing that we do. I can't think of anything that we do that isn't a kind of combination of the two. I mean, I think I tried to say that in the original thing that I said, but I love, there's a kind of writer that I particularly like who writes about English education, called Arthur Appleby, an American. He's dead now. And he talks about knowledge in action. And I think that's everything that we do is knowledge in action. It's a kind of know-how. So if we're doing close reading of a text, that's a doing thing. We have skills that we apply when we close read a text, but it's totally created by our knowledge of texts, our knowledge of genre, our knowledge of language, of other forms of literature, of other texts we've read, etc., etc. So you know, we're making meaning, and that's a phrase that is rarely used these days, but used to be used a lot. We're making meaning when we read, and we're making meaning when we write. It's an active, skills-based thing, but it's deeply intertwined with our knowledge.
Well, Thomas has said we are all preaching to the choir. How do you reach beyond the choir to the larger parish, the diocese, the church? If there are people listening, Thomas, who want to get in touch with you and actively collaborating with your project, how do they do it?
Thank you very much for the invitation, Robert. My email is easily available. I am Thomas Karshan, Karshan, and I would be honored to hear from you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I think that more or less wraps up proceedings. There's something else in the chat, is there, Becky? No, I think we're all preaching to the choir. That's Thomas. Okay. So you end up singing. So thank you for everybody for these very lively and articulate contributions. And thank you to you too, Becky, for having us.
Oh, you're welcome. What a treat it's been to listen in this afternoon. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy your evenings. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Bye.